The lake behind the property wasn't just water, it was the heart of the land. The homeowner had chosen this particular lot years ago because of it. A quiet mirror nestled between trees, carrying the whispers of wind and the ripple of fish beneath its glassy surface. Unlike the manicured lawns and uniform hedges that lined the rest of the neighborhood, the lake was wild, untamed, and alive. It offered peace, serenity, and above all, a pastime that had been in his blood since childhood: fishing. The homeowner's small dock stretched out into the water. Not fancy, not expensive, just weathered boards nailed together over the years. Each morning, when the mist still clung low and the sun had not yet broken through the clouds, he would walk out with a rod in hand and settle into the quiet. Fish were plentiful, mostly bass and trout, sometimes even the flash of a catfish breaking the surface. To him, the lake was not just recreation. It was therapy, a reminder of simpler times and the only escape from the suffocating grip of the neighborhood association that ruled everything else. The HOA had never liked it. They had rules about everything, rules about what color mailbox one could own, the height of grass, the type of mulch allowed around flower beds. They called it preserving property value, but everyone knew it was about control. For years they had grumbled about the dock, about the way fishing poles leaned against the porch, about the fact that the lake wasn't listed as a community amenity, but sat directly behind one homeowner's property. They claimed the lake was communal and subject to their oversight, but deeds and maps said otherwise. The lake belonged to the property, carved into its boundary lines long before the HOA was ever formed. Still, they pushed. Letters arrived in the mailbox, thin envelopes with official HOA letterheads, each one filled with warnings, fines, and stern reminders of compliance. The homeowner ignored most of them. Fishing wasn't a crime, but the tension grew like a storm. At HOA meetings, whispers spread about the unsightly dock, about how fishing attracted pests, about how water activity damaged the aesthetic appeal of the community. He knew who the ringleader was, the HOA president, a sharp-eyed woman with a permanent scowl, known among neighbors for her obsessive control over everything from mailbox paint to holiday decorations. The truth was simpler. The HOA couldn't stand that someone had something they didn't control. The lake wasn't theirs. It wasn't under their rules, and that made them furious. The breaking point came one summer afternoon when he noticed strange signs along the edge of the lake. Warning! Water unsafe! The signs weren't from the city. They weren't from environmental authorities. They bore the HOA's insignia, laminated and nailed into posts driven into the soil. The homeowner frowned but continued fishing. Surely this was just another attempt to scare him. But then, a week later, he noticed the fish. They weren't biting. Some floated lifeless near the reeds, their silver scales dull, their bodies stiff. The smell began soon after, faint at first, then unmistakable. Something had poisoned the water. Confusion turned to anger. The HOA had gone too far. They weren't just meddling anymore. They were tampering with nature, destroying the life of the lake to make a point. It wasn't about rules or aesthetics or property values. It was about control, and they had taken their obsession to dangerous new levels. But what they didn't know, what they had overlooked in their zeal to destroy the lake, was the hidden tie between this quiet body of water and their own lives. The HOA board members, in their arrogance, had failed to realize that the same lake they poisoned was connected to the underground aquifer feeding the neighborhood's private water system. Every drop they drank, every shower they took, every sink they washed their hands in, it all traced back to the same water they had just contaminated. The homeowner realized this truth slowly, almost by accident. A conversation with an old neighbor revealed that when the development was built, the builders had tapped into natural groundwater reserves beneath the lake to supply the homes. It was cheaper than running city lines, and it gave the HOA one more thing to brag about: pure natural water. That boast was now their curse. The homeowner stood on the dock one late evening, the sun bleeding red across the poisoned water, and he felt no joy. The lake was dying. His sanctuary was slipping away, but under the sorrow was something sharper, something heavier, the knowledge that the HOA had sown their own destruction. He would not need to fight them directly. The water they had poisoned was the water they depended on. It would only be a matter of time before the first cracks appeared. At first, the changes were subtle, too faint to be noticed by anyone who wasn't paying close attention. The grass, once trimmed into perfect emerald carpets, began to dull in color. Leaves along the shoreline trees curled and browned at the edges. Birds that once sang at dawn disappeared, replaced by silence. The lake, once alive with movement, now lay still, its surface dark and opaque, reflecting only the gloom of the sky above. The homeowner stood at his window and watched as the water began to die. What was once his sanctuary had become a mirror of decay. The fish that had once darted beneath the surface were gone. The reeds sagged, heavy with the weight of toxins. And still, the HOA said nothing. They had succeeded in their mission, or so they thought. They had taken away his joy, his peace, his hobby. In their eyes, the lake was now secured. No one would fish here again. The signs remained, flapping in the wind like flags of conquest. But beneath the surface, something unseen was already beginning to spread. The poison that had seeped into the water did not remain contained. It drifted downward into the soil, sinking through layers of earth until it reached the veins of groundwater below. The aquifer that fed every tap, every sprinkler system, every irrigation line, it all began to carry the same invisible taint. It started with complaints. One homeowner, then another. Strange smells in the water. A faint metallic taste. Residents grumbled on the community forum, asking if anyone else had noticed. Some thought it was the plumbing, others blamed the filters. The HOA dismissed it all as hysteria. They assured everyone the community's private water system was one of the cleanest in the county. But reassurance could not wash away the truth. The first real sign came one morning when a row of flower beds along the main boulevard began to wither overnight. The HOA prided itself on those flower beds, arranged with precision, their colors rotating with the seasons. When the blossoms turned gray and the stems drooped, panic rippled through the board. Maintenance crews were dispatched, soil samples were tested, fertilizers changed. Nothing helped. Each new planting wilted faster than the last. Soon after, the lawns began to die. The lush green fields the HOA had enforced with threats and fines turned patchy and brittle. Sprinklers continued to hum each morning, spreading the poisoned water evenly across every yard. The entire community was watering their homes with the same toxin that had killed the lake. The homeowner said nothing. He watched from his porch as neighbors gathered outside, puzzled and frustrated. Some knocked on his door, asking if he had noticed it too. He would nod, calm and quiet, offering no answers. The lake behind him was now a dull, stagnant pool, ringed with decay. It no longer attracted attention. The HOA had gotten what they wanted, a lifeless view that no one dared approach. But then came the illnesses. It began with small things, rashes, headaches, nausea. A few residents dismissed it as seasonal allergies or bad weather. But as days passed, more and more began to suffer. Families called plumbers, then doctors. A strange coincidence emerged. Every home connected to the private water line was affected. Children refused to drink from the tap. Pets grew sick. Even the community clubhouse's fountains, once symbols of prosperity, turned cloudy and foul-smelling. The HOA grew desperate. Emergency meetings were held, letters circulated, accusations flew. They blamed the utility company, the landscapers, even the weather. Anything but themselves. Yet behind their frantic denials, one quiet truth lingered in the shadows. They had done this. Their own hands had poisoned the source. The homeowner knew. He had pieced it all together, The pattern, the timing, the cause. The poison in the lake was never meant to be seen, never meant to spread. It had been chosen precisely for its subtlety, something that would kill fish and plants quietly without leaving obvious signs. But nature had a way of revealing truth in its own time. By the third week, the HOA's pristine reputation began to crumble. Word leaked beyond the neighborhood gates. Delivery drivers complained about the smell. A local landscaper refused to work there, claiming the soil was contaminated. Real estate listings were quietly pulled. For the first time in years, homes sat unsold. Still, the board clung to its authority. They ordered a private water test, one they could control. When the results came back inconclusive, they paraded them as proof that everything was fine. But the residents weren't fooled. The signs were everywhere. In the brittle lawns, the withered trees, the sick pets. Whispers turned into anger, murmurs into confrontation. One evening, as the sun sank behind the ruined lake, the homeowner stood on his dock again, though now it creaked beneath him like an old skeleton. The water below no longer reflected light. It absorbed it. From his porch, he could hear the distant voices of neighbors arguing, their unity fracturing under the weight of mistrust. The HOA that once dictated every blade of grass was now losing control. It was poetic, almost. They had poisoned his peace to preserve their power, and in doing so had destroyed their own foundation. Their pride had blinded them. And now, nature was collecting its due. As darkness fell, the homeowner turned from the lake and walked back toward his house. He didn't need revenge anymore. The water was doing it for him. But he also knew this was far from over. The HOA wouldn't accept defeat quietly. They would dig, deny, and fight to reclaim their image. And when they did, the truth would surface, ugly, undeniable, and impossible to bury. The storm they had created was only just beginning. The HOA had built its reputation on order, on control, precision, and the illusion of perfection. For years, they had ruled the neighborhood like a miniature government, issuing fines, citations, and warnings with bureaucratic confidence. But now, as the lawns turned brown and fountains festered with algae, the mask of authority began to slip. At first, they tried to manage the crisis the same way they handled every other problem, through denial and paperwork. They sent emails reassuring residents that everything was under control. They cited routine maintenance, temporary imbalances, and environmental fluctuations. They told homeowners to flush their taps, to change filters, to trust the process. But behind closed doors, panic spread like wildfire. The HOA board gathered in the clubhouse, a sterile room that once smelled of lemon polish and new carpet, now tinged with the faint odor of decay from the nearby fountain. The president sat at the head of the table, her expression tight. For years, she had maintained her power through intimidation and procedure. But now, with residents demanding answers, her authority was cracking. Reports from contractors piled high on the table. Landscapers couldn't fix the dying lawns. Pest control couldn't stop the wave of insects that had begun nesting near the poisoned water. Even the maintenance team refused to go near the lake after one worker fell ill from exposure. The president called it coincidence. Others began to call it karma. It wasn't long before word reached beyond the gates. A local environmental group, tipped off by a concerned resident, began asking questions. They wanted samples, records, test results. The HOA tried to stall them, citing private property rights. But in doing so, they drew even more attention. The community that once prided itself on exclusivity now stood under a growing cloud of suspicion. Meanwhile, inside the neighborhood, tension mounted. Neighbors who once smiled politely across white fences now glared with accusation. Some blamed the landscapers. Others whispered that the HOA had done something terrible. And at the center of it all, the homeowner with the lake sat quietly, watching the chaos unfold. He didn't need to speak. The truth was unraveling on its own. He remembered the night he had first seen them, Two men in plain clothes working along the shoreline weeks ago. They had come under the cover of darkness, carrying containers marked with hazard symbols. He hadn't confronted them then. He had watched, waited, and later found the faint chemical smell along the bank. He knew what they had done. But they had been careless. In their arrogance, they had left traces, muddy footprints, disturbed soil, and a discarded label that the wind had carried toward his dock. He had kept it. Now, as the HOA floundered, he took the label from a drawer, a small, torn piece of plastic with a chemical name printed across it. It wasn't a household pesticide or herbicide. It was an industrial-grade toxin banned in most residential areas. The kind of substance that killed not only fish, but everything that drank from the water it touched. He didn't show it yet. He waited. Patience was its own kind of justice. Back at the clubhouse, the HOA board began to turn on each other. The treasurer accused the maintenance director of negligence. The secretary suggested calling in the county for help, only to be silenced by the president, who feared legal repercussions. The poison was doing more than killing plants. It was corroding the trust that bound them together. Every decision they made to cover their tracks only deepened their guilt. Soon, the health department received anonymous complaints. They dispatched inspectors. The HOA tried to delay them, claiming private jurisdiction, but the inspectors came anyway. They took samples from taps, from sprinklers, from the dying fountain at the entrance. The president followed them nervously, insisting there was nothing wrong. When the preliminary results came back, they were damning. Elevated levels of contaminants, traces of toxins not naturally occurring, warnings that the water was unsafe for consumption. The inspectors demanded to know if any chemicals had been used near the lake or the groundwater. The board denied everything, but denial couldn't erase the evidence. Residents began to revolt. Emergency meetings grew heated. The HOA's reputation, once untouchable, now lay in ruins. Homeowners who had once feared them now shouted them down, waving the inspection results in their faces. Some threatened lawsuits. Others demanded resignations. The homeowner attended none of these meetings. He didn't need to. The lake, once his sanctuary, had become their undoing. The irony wasn't lost on him. They had destroyed the water to keep him from fishing. And now, it was their own thirst that would never be quenched. Still, part of him mourned. The lake behind his home was beyond saving. Its surface had turned the color of rust, its banks littered with the husks of fish and insects. The life that once thrived there was gone. He walked its edge in silence each morning, remembering what it had been and wondering if it would ever heal. But as much as the lake was dying, something else was being reborn. The balance of power in the neighborhood had shifted. The HOA, once feared, now faced open rebellion. Their polished image had cracked wide open, exposing the rot beneath. Residents began forming their own committee, talking about voting the board out entirely, and through it all, the homeowner held his silence. He knew what they had done. He knew how deeply the poison had spread. But there was one more truth still buried, one that would turn suspicion into certainty. The piece of evidence he had kept would soon become the final blow. The board thought they could contain the damage. They thought they could spin the narrative, shift the blame, control the story. But the water beneath their feet held the truth, and truth, like water, always finds a way to rise. As the sun set behind the dying trees, the homeowner tucked the chemical label back into his pocket. The time was coming. They had started this, and now they would face the consequences. By the fourth week, the illusion of order had completely collapsed. The once pristine neighborhood, with its perfectly measured lawns and polished driveways, now looked weary, its beauty rotting from beneath. The water had done its quiet work, seeping through pipes and soil, spreading decay not only in nature but in trust, in unity, in pride. The HOA's grip, once ironclad, was slipping beyond recovery. Rumors now traveled faster than truth. Some residents claimed the HOA had used illegal chemicals to sterilize the lake. Others whispered that they had buried something toxic nearby. Mothers kept their children indoors. Gardeners refused to come. And while the HOA continued to issue carefully worded statements insisting no contamination existed, the stench of corruption hung thicker than the smell rising from the dead fountain at the neighborhood entrance. Then came the news vans. A local reporter, tipped off by the environmental group, arrived one morning to film the dying lake. The segment aired that evening, footage of gray water, dead fish, and brittle lawns, intercut with interviews from frustrated residents. The story spread faster than anyone expected. Overnight, the neighborhood's reputation transformed from a symbol of luxury into a case study in environmental negligence. The HOA tried to contain the fallout. The president called an emergency press conference, standing stiffly in front of the clubhouse as cameras rolled. She insisted the contamination was naturally occurring and under investigation. But when a reporter asked why the HOA had placed warning signs around the lake weeks before, she faltered. Cameras caught every flicker of panic in her eyes. Inside his home, the lake's owner watched the broadcast in silence. It was time. For weeks, he had waited, letting their lies unravel under their own weight. But now the moment had come to reveal what he had known all along. The piece of plastic he had found, the torn chemical label, wasn't just evidence. It was the smoking gun. The label's name was unmistakable. An industrial-grade toxin banned in residential zones, known to kill aquatic life and render soil infertile. It was manufactured for large-scale industrial use, not neighborhoods. A single bottle could destroy an entire ecosystem if mishandled, and this one had been used deliberately. He took photos of the label, the footprints, and the poisoned shoreline, then sent them anonymously to the same environmental group that had begun the investigation. Within days, they traced the toxin to a local supplier and discovered that a bulk order had been placed under a false name, paid for with funds linked to the HOA's maintenance budget. The news broke like a thunderclap. The HOA had not only poisoned the lake, they had used community money to do it. The revelation ignited outrage. Residents filled the clubhouse for an emergency town meeting, their anger now unstoppable. The president stood before them, flanked by board members, her voice shaking as she tried to defend herself. But no one listened. The accusations came from every corner of the room. People demanded refunds, resignations, answers. Some shouted that their pets had died after drinking from outdoor bowls filled by sprinklers. Others waved copies of water test results, proving contamination in their homes. The board tried to shift blame to contractors, landscapers, anyone but themselves. But when the treasurer finally broke down and admitted that a chemical treatment had been authorized to discourage fishing, the crowd erupted. In that moment, the final thread of authority snapped. The president was forced to step down that night, escorted from the clubhouse under a chorus of furious voices. The remaining board members scattered, desperate to distance themselves from the scandal. For the first time in years, the homeowners realized the HOA wasn't a TA shield of order. It was a cage built on fear and vanity. And now, that cage lay in pieces. The next morning, government inspectors arrived in full force. They cordoned off the lake, took samples from the groundwater, and began mapping the extent of contamination. What they found was worse than anyone had expected. The poison had spread far beyond the shoreline, seeping into the aquifer beneath half the neighborhood. Cleanup would take months, maybe years. Property values plummeted overnight. From his porch, the homeowner watched it all unfold. Trucks rumbled down the once quiet streets, hauling equipment and containment barriers. Workers in hazmat suits tested soil and water. The HOA signs that once dictated no parking and no fishing now stood beside bright orange warnings, hazard area, contaminated water source. The irony wasn't lost on him. They had wanted control. Control of the view, control of his hobby, control of every inch of life around them. And in trying to assert that control, They had lost everything. But even in victory, the homeowner felt no joy. The lake was a grave now. Its water would never again reflect the sunrise as it once had. Its fish would never return. He had won, yes, but the price of that victory was too high to celebrate. Still, there was one final act left in this unraveling drama. The county had begun tracing accountability. Civil suits loomed. Environmental fines were certain. And while the HOA no longer existed in name, those responsible still walked free, hoping the storm would pass. But the storm was only beginning to gather. Evidence had surfaced. The public was watching. And when the full report was released, naming those who had authorized the poisoning, their reputations, their finances, and their lives would collapse as swiftly as the ecosystem they had destroyed. The homeowner knew it wasn't over. Justice, like water, took its time. But once it began to flow, nothing could stop it. That night, as he stood at the edge of the dead lake, the wind carried the faint scent of rot and earth. He closed his eyes and listened. For a moment, beneath the silence, he thought he could hear something faint, like the ghostly ripple of waves that once danced beneath his dock. Nature forgets slowly, but it never forgives. The investigation spread like a slow-moving wildfire, methodical, relentless, and impossible to contain. What began as whispers of wrongdoing had evolved into a full-scale environmental scandal. Officials combed through financial records, subpoenaed emails, and interviewed witnesses. Every secret the HOA had buried beneath layers of paperwork began clawing its way to the surface. The homeowners who once feared the board now watched with grim satisfaction as those who had ruled them unraveled. The HOA president, once the face of suburban authority, became the centerpiece of a public investigation. Reporters camped outside her home, their cameras ready to capture every glimpse of her downfall. She tried to maintain composure, but each day the cracks deepened, neighbors avoiding her, friends disappearing, her reputation dissolving under the heat of exposure. For years, she had believed the HOA was untouchable, a fortress built on regulations and fear. But now that fortress was rubble. Every decision she had made, every signature she had placed on a document was being dissected. It turned out that the poison used on the lake wasn't just illegal. It was purchased using community funds hidden under a maintenance budget. That meant every homeowner, every family in the neighborhood had unknowingly paid for the very toxin that poisoned their homes. The outrage was overwhelming. Lawsuits multiplied. The county filed charges for environmental violations, and residents followed with civil suits for property damage and health impacts. The HOA's bank account was frozen, their insurance policies revoked. What little money remained went to legal fees. One by one, the board members turned on each other, each claiming ignorance, each blaming someone else. But documents don't lie. Email chains revealed everything. The board had discussed finding a chemical deterrent to preserve community aesthetics and discourage lake usage. They had debated options, dismissing safer, lawful alternatives as ineffective. The president had signed off on the final purchase herself. They had known it was risky, but they believed they could control it. They believed it would only affect the surface water. They were wrong. Meanwhile, the neighborhood continued to wither. Cleanup crews had fenced off entire sections of land, turning once beautiful homes into gray zones of plastic barriers and warning signs. Trucks came and went daily, pumping contaminated soil, drilling test wells, and marking the ground with flags. The hum of machinery replaced birdsong. The air smelled of chemicals and mud. Some families began to move out, abandoning homes that could no longer be sold. For sale signs lined the streets, but no buyers came. The neighborhood that once boasted premier lakeside living was now synonymous with contamination. The Homeowners Association, once the enforcer of perfection, had become a cautionary tale of greed and arrogance. Through it all, the homeowner with the lake remained silent. He had no need to speak. The evidence had spoken for him. The local news referred to him only as the property owner affected by the poisoning. They didn't know the full story, the years of conflict, the warnings ignored, the petty fines and harassment. But he knew, and each morning, as he looked upon the lake's ruined surface, he reminded himself that nature's revenge was never loud. It was patient. The HOA president tried to salvage what was left of her life. She claimed ignorance, insisting she had trusted contractors and consultants. But investigators found her approval signature on the purchase order. Her name was tied to the expense. Her justification was that she believed the chemical was eco-safe. The supplier, under questioning, denied ever making such a claim. Soon after, the first arrests were made. The environmental authorities charged the president and 2 board members with negligence and misuse of community funds. The local news captured footage of them being led away in handcuffs, their perfect suburban facade shattered in full view of the public. The residents gathered quietly that evening, standing in clusters outside their homes as the sun set behind the ruined lake. There was no celebration, no cheering, only silence. Justice, when it finally arrived, felt heavy. The neighborhood had been built on control, and now it lay broken by the very hands that once enforced it. Weeks later, the state environmental agency released a detailed report. It confirmed what many suspected. The toxin used was banned for residential areas and had contaminated the aquifer to a depth that would take years to restore. Cleanup costs were estimated in the millions. Property values had dropped by nearly 70%. The once pristine suburb was now classified as an environmental hazard zone. Still, nature showed faint signs of healing. Rain had begun to wash through the soil, diluting the contamination bit by bit. Around the edges of the lake, a few stubborn plants began to grow again. They were small, fragile, but alive. The homeowner took quiet comfort in that. He knew the land would remember, but he also knew it would not remain dead forever. The community, too, began to rebuild, not through control, but through cooperation. Without the HOA's iron hand, neighbors started helping one another. They shared cleanup equipment, replanted gardens, and checked on families who had fallen ill. For the first time in years, they acted like a community, not subjects. Yet the scars remained. The clubhouse sat empty, its windows boarded, its walls tagged with warning signs. The fountain out front, once the pride of the neighborhood, was gone, replaced by a dry pit waiting for restoration. The HOA's legacy had become a monument to arrogance, a reminder of how easily order could turn to ruin when fueled by greed. And in the midst of it all, the man with the lake continued his quiet vigil. He didn't seek praise or recognition. The world had already given him justice in its own way. His lake would one day heal, and when it did, it would stand as a testament to patience, to the truth that no one truly controls nature. But even as balance slowly began to return, the final chapter of this story had yet to be written. There was one more reckoning to come, one that would reach beyond the fences of the neighborhood and into the lives of those who thought they could bury the past. Because in the end, the water remembers everything. Time moved differently after the fall. Seasons no longer marked the rhythm of suburban life through freshly mowed lawns or holiday banners. Instead, they were measured in the slow return of color to the land, in the cautious regrowth of grass, and in the gradual fading of warning signs that once lined every path. The neighborhood, once obsessed with appearances, now existed in quiet humility. The lake, once poisoned, silent, and still, had begun to stir again. It would never be what it was, not entirely. Too much had been lost, too much tainted. But nature, in its quiet persistence, had started to reclaim what was hers. Along the edges of the shore, reeds rose timidly through the silt. Frogs returned before fish did, their low croaks breaking the silence at dusk. And with each rainfall, the water cleared. shedding another layer of the toxin that had once darkened its depths. The homeowner stood at the edge of his dock, now repaired and sturdy again, and watched the reflection ripple gently across the surface. It wasn't crystal blue. It wasn't perfect. But it was alive. That, he knew, was enough. The neighborhood itself had changed. The HOA was gone, dismantled under legal pressure and bankruptcy. Its former leaders faced trials and fines, their lives reduced to case files and court appearances. The president, once so feared, was now a symbol of suburban corruption, her name spoken only in whispers. For years, she had ruled with authority born of vanity. Now, her fall served as a warning to anyone who mistook power for ownership. In her absence, the residents had formed something different, not an association, not a hierarchy, just a circle of neighbors who met once a month to discuss shared concerns. There were no fines, no threats, no rules written in small print. They tended the land together, cared for one another, and learned what community meant without the need for control. The poison had taken much, but it had also burned away the illusion that had once bound them. The cleanup crews were gone now, though their marks remained. Faint outlines in the soil showed where containment barriers once stood. Some yards still bore the scars of excavation, patches of dirt where grass refused to grow. Yet in those scars was truth. They no longer hid behind the facade of perfection. They accepted their imperfections as part of their story. Reporters stopped coming long ago. The world had moved on to other scandals, other neighborhoods, but the memory lingered. The story of the poisoned lake became a lesson shared in environmental circles, a warning taught in training seminars, a tale of how arrogance could turn paradise into wasteland. It was cited in local papers whenever someone tried to overstep nature's boundaries again. The community had become a footnote in the broader struggle between human order and natural law, and through it all, the homeowner remained. He didn't move away when property values fell. He didn't cash out or abandon what was broken. He stayed because the lake was part of him. Its healing was his healing. There was peace in that patience. Every morning he took his rod down to the dock, not to fish, but to remember. The water wasn't ready for that yet. But he would sit there, watching the mist rise and the sunlight scatter across the ripples, waiting for the day when the first fish might return. He knew it would happen. Life always finds its way back. Sometimes new families came to the neighborhood. They didn't know the full story, only fragments. They saw the fenced-off areas, the signs of restoration, the faded news clippings pinned in the clubhouse-turned-community center. When they asked, the older residents would tell them the truth. They didn't hide it or sugarcoat it. They spoke of how control had turned to destruction, how pride had poisoned what was pure, and how humility had rebuilt what power had destroyed. The homeowner often listened quietly when those stories were told. He didn't correct them, didn't claim credit or victimhood. He had learned that truth didn't need ownership. It only needed witnesses. One autumn evening, as the leaves began to turn gold, he noticed something beneath the water's surface. A faint flash of silver. He leaned closer. For a brief moment, it darted past the reeds, quick and graceful. A fish. Small, fragile, but real. His heart lifted. After years of stillness, life had returned. He stayed there until the stars came out, watching the gentle movement below. The lake had taken everything, the calm, the beauty, the peace, and then given it back, transformed. It was no longer a symbol of solitude or defiance. It was something greater now, a living reminder of consequence, of endurance, of balance restored. The neighborhood lights shimmered faintly on the water. Somewhere a child laughed. Somewhere else, a neighbor called across the street. These sounds, once trivial, now carried meaning. They were signs that life had outlasted ruin. The homeowner closed his eyes and breathed in the cool night air. For the first time in years, the scent was clean. The poison was gone. washed away by time and truth. All that remained was the memory, etched not in bitterness, but in understanding. He knew he would grow old here, beside the lake. He would watch as trees thickened, as grass turned green again, as fish returned in schools. He would never forget what had happened, but he no longer needed to. The water remembered for him, and in that memory lay a promise that no matter how deeply humans scar the land, nature always waits. Patient, unyielding, ready to reclaim what was lost, and to remind those who listen that balance cannot be dictated. It can only be earned. The man sat on his dock until the night grew still. The water lapped softly against the wood, no longer toxic, no longer silent. In its reflection, the stars trembled like distant embers, alive, untouchable, eternal. And for the first time in a long time, the lake felt like home again.